Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our featured guest today is Marcello Di Cintio. He is the prize-winning author of 6 books, including Walrus, Travels Along the Barricades, Pay No Heed to the Rockets, Palestine in the Present Tense, and Driven, The Secret Lives of Taxi Drivers. He's also written for the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, the International New York Times, and Canadian Geographic, among others. He lives in Calgary. His latest work for Windsor's Biblioasis Press is Precarious, The Lives of Migrant Workers. Welcome back to the show, Marcello.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And such an important book. There's been a lot of discussion in Canadian publishing recently about the downturn in the will to publish long-form nonfiction. So it's great that this important topic is presented as a whole book. Why was it important for you to pursue this format for your subject?
Oh, this format is the only format I know how to write in. I do that. That's a bit of a joke for sure. I've written magazine length pieces about migrant labor policy and about many other things. The layers though that Canada's migrant worker policy contain. If you want to do an overview of the system while including the personal accounts of the workers, which for me was the most important thing, and including the history of the programs themselves, that requires 300 pages. At least, you know what I mean. And I think in order, unless you're doing a thumbnail sketch of a very particular aspect of this very complicated program, then it kind of it behooves the writer to pull the camera way back and see the big picture. And it's important too, that big picture, because, and I get into this in the book several times, is that picking out individual parts of the program or individual stories or even individual examples of exploitation and abuse don't really tell the whole story, which is that the entire system, right from its conception decades ago, has always been weaponized to exploit. In fact, it's built in that bad employers can act badly, and so if our focus is too narrow, if we focus on that one terrible farm owner, that doesn't tell the story, because that one terrible farm owner is only allowed to be terrible because the system itself allows it and has done so for decades.
In the introduction to this book, you tell us about a relative who was what you call a migrant worker. Tell us a bit more about him and how he inspired you.
Oh, my grandfather, my dear Nono. My grandfather passed away in 2020. And that's when I started thinking about migrant labor in a wider sense, because my grandfather, he's from Italy, fought in World War II. Was taken a prisoner of war during World War II, and when he was finally released, vowed to never leave Italy again. He loved his home, he loved his hometown. He married, he had 3 daughters, one of them was my mother, and decided he wants this to be home. But they were poor, and he worked on someone else's farm, growing tobacco, being able to keep only a small share of the proceeds from that. And my grandmother, who's fierce and remains so at 99 years old as of last week, she essentially booted my grandfather out of the country and said, go to Canada, like where your cousins are, and to find work and to improve our situation. And that's what he did. He went to Canada. He wanted to be here for 2 years and send money home, and then he wanted to go back. And he did that. He worked in construction and in greenhouses, just like migrant workers do these days. Sent the money home. But my grandmother again made the decisions, and she said, "No, you're not coming home. We're coming to you." So she packed up the girls, and they took the boat across the Atlantic, and that's how we ended up Canadian. And in fact, you can link back hundreds of Calgary Italians to my grandfather. He's one of the first kind of links in that chain immigration, right? And so when he passed away in 2020, like I mentioned, it was during the pandemic. Because of the distancing rules, the church was very sparsely attended, right? Only a few relatives. Had it been a normal time, that church would have been overflowing with grateful Italians coming to pay respects to my grandfather. And in the wake of his passing, I thought a lot about his life as he was a migrant worker before that was even a term. And the difference though between his experience and the experience of contemporary migrant workers is that he was allowed to stay. He didn't want to at first, but he had that choice. Now, all these other workers these days, and for the past several decades, who make the same choices and sacrifices that my grandfather made, come here to work in greenhouses and construction sites to send money home. They are not given that opportunity. We welcome their labor, but we don't welcome them. And I was very interested in that dichotomy. And what are the stories of these men and women who are essentially the same as my grandfather, but are offered such a different opportunity?
Well, congratulations to your grandmother on her birthday, and also to your grandfather on being sort of the fountainhead of that community in Calgary. So you have a great deal of experience writing nonfiction. Did your research techniques for this book change at all? Or do you have a tried and true method?
Oh my God, I have no method. I have no method. But I think like most nonfiction writers, I adore research. In fact, I rather research than write, and I don't think I speak just for myself in that. And so my process for all my books is just to go down these allow myself to be led down the rabbit holes, right? To keep searching for articles and academic papers and history and just go. I love it so much. I can't tell you how much I love it. What was a little bit different in this, what made this book different than my other ones, I suppose, was my research required me learning policy. And that's not a natural skill of mine to learn. And so I really had to get a sense of these, often complicated, labor policies, immigration policies, and not just so that I could understand them, but I can somehow translate them into regular English for my readers. My readership, my audience is not academic. They're not policymakers. Sure, they're welcome to it, but that's not who I'm writing for. So the challenge was taking all that research, understanding it for myself, which was a challenge, and then distilling it in a way that my readers could understand what's going on, but not be bogged down with it. The trick, I think, for a nonfiction writer of long form like this, when it comes to research, is not to fall in love with our research too deeply, and B, to only give the reader what they need when they need it. Because we get excited when we learn things, we just want to pile it into the text, and that serves the narrative no purpose, and it drives our readers crazy. So it really is about giving them what they need when they need it, and that's it. And that's trickier. That's harder, more difficult to do than it sounds.
For sure. And talking about challenges, can you tell us a little bit about the challenges of interviewing the migrant workers themselves?
Yeah, I was under no illusions that I could just go, wander up to a farm and talk to workers, or knock on someone's door and talk to some caregiver, right? I knew that I would need introductions. I would need a middleman to get me to those workers. And I thought, well, this shouldn't be a problem because there are dozens of organizations across the country that kind of serve the migrant worker community. Almost every province has multiple of these types of organizations. So I reached out to them under the naive assumption that they'd be happy to pass me on to workers who wanted to talk. And I found that for the most part, they didn't. I think the organizations are protective of the workers that they represent, and for good reason. What I talk about in the book, and perhaps we'll talk about in this interview, is is the precarity of the workers. They are here on these closed permits. They can only work for one employer. And if they say something to a writer or something in public that sounds like complaining or paints the employer in a bad light, and they get fired, then they're supposed to go home. Then all the opportunity that they came here to enjoy is gone. So there's certainly a hesitation and a reticence for workers to talk to people like me, and therefore a reticence and a hesitation for those organizations to introduce workers to people like me. So it took a while for me to earn trust in that sense. Once I got those introductions, however, and I met workers who did want to talk, man, did they ever want to talk? You know, there's so many stories, often personally traumatic, that they wanted me to know, and not just me to know. They wanted Canadians to know. And there's a couple points in the book where I was talking to people who had gone through hell here. I remember one caregiver in particular from India who's not just the mistreatment she suffered by her employers, but the bureaucratic nightmare that she ended up in. And she hadn't seen her teenage daughters in years. She was losing her hair. She was not sleeping, and she contemplated suicide multiple times. And she's telling me these stories, and she's weeping on the phone. And I said, listen, you don't have to tell me this stuff. You know, I felt like I was exploiting at that point. I felt like I was just as bad as these employers. I was taking something from her that she didn't want to give. And I said, listen, we can stop. We don't have to talk at all. Like, just, and even through kind of her tears and she got so upset, her English started to slip. But even through all that, she's like, no, I really believe that people need to hear this. And I'm so grateful for those workers who are willing to share those stories. Some of them are incredibly painful.
I'm sure that they were grateful to have that opportunity to share with someone who addressed their stories with such competence and sensitivity too.
But there was a leap of faith for those workers too. Yes, they trusted me to write sensitively, but they had no reason to trust me. None of these workers knew who I was, read my work. You know what I mean? So for them, it was a leap of faith, and that made me even more grateful.
So how did you go about selecting which stories from all of this treasure trove of stories to tell in your book? Was it in conjunction with your editor, or did you work it out on your own in the manuscript and the writing process?
Well, certainly after drafts were written, my editor and I banged stuff out like that for sure. But before that, it was me on my own selecting. And yes, I spoke to dozens and dozens and dozens of workers. And I guess what I wanted to do was have enough stories in there that kind of shone a light on the vast stories that were here and the scope of the policies, without repeating myself too many times. You know, I wanted to make sure there are people that I was interviewing workers from many different countries in many different sectors. So I kind of wanted to have the diversity of not just voices, but of stories. And this happens with all of my books. You know, you talk to a bunch of people, all of whom are telling you something important to their life, to talk about their lives. And then you, as the cold writer / editor, has to decide whether this person's story is worthy for the book. You know, you can't have everybody. So you have 3 stories of abuse on a farm. I'm not going to take all 3. You know what I mean? So I have to choose, which is not to say that the person that gets cut out, their story is any less valuable or whatever. It's just, that's just the kind of the cruel nature of writing a book. And I always feel terrible about that. It's, terrible where people will sit with me, tell their stories, give me their time, and then in the end, it doesn't appear anywhere. And what I always say is that, regardless of if they end up in the final draft of a book, everyone I talk to contributes to my knowledge of the subject, contributes to and so, like, it's they're always contributing. It just might not be their name on the page.
Yes, apparently there's a lot to process after writing a book like this. After a lighthearted gathering of migrant workers, you were informed that one worker had died in a workplace accident. In fact, didn't someone text you about it? How do you cope with processing this information so it can be shared?
Oh God, what a great question. And not an easy one to answer. And it's a tough part of the author's job, I suppose. Yeah, that day, I was attending this lovely, fun soccer tournament for migrant workers. And in the middle of it, I was texted a photograph of the body of a man who had been killed either that morning or the previous evening, and they found him in this tobacco harvester. Um, yeah, and so writing about Garvin was his name, right? Writing about Garvin, it introduces kind of ethical dilemma for a writer, especially as an outsider, especially as a white guy, who far more resembles the employer than it resembles the worker, right? In every aspect. Um, and so I did as well as I could to talk to learn about Garvin's life, um, beyond just the day that he died, and so I looked up, you know, conversations that they had with his widow. I was scouring Jamaican newspapers to find news of this story because it didn't get a ton of coverage up here in Canada. I reached out to people in the community as much as I could. They didn't really want to talk to me. But it was the goal for me was to kind of paint as as a complete a picture of this man as I could, with the limited resources that I had, so as I'm not just presenting him as a body in a machine. Um, and uh, and then following up with the court case, which as far as I know now has still not been resolved, but there was launched a kind of a case against the employer for Garvin's death. Um, and I even reached out. I reached out to his widow too. She didn't respond, and which I understand. Again, it goes back to what we said before. She doesn't know who I am and has no reason to trust me. But I think the trick as a writer is to do everything that we can to make the picture complete. Just out of respect, right? I mean, I owe it to Garvin to do that and to his family.
For sure. Yeah, it was very sad. In this region, Windsor, Essex, where we produce our podcast, Leamington nearby has a huge number of migrant workers who provide food for us. And you even quote novelist Nino Ricci on his family's experience. What was unique about the migrant experience here that you wanted to highlight?
In Leamington, in particular, like the Windsor area, Ontario agriculture is kind of the first sector that drew migrant workers, in the first place, starting in the 60s. This is kind of ground zero for migrant labor history, in a lot of ways in this country. So there's that. There's also I suspect I don't know if these numbers exist, but the kind of the concentration of workers in one particular area, this has got to be one of the highest. Maybe Norfolk is maybe more, but I don't even think so. I think Leamington there's the most workers in the area, and I was so fascinated by like what the workers here kind of contributed to Leamington as a city. Like I was so thrilled to walk down the streets of Leamington and see all these Mexican restaurants, and seeing workers on the street and seeing Spanish signs in the windows. I mean, all stuff from the Caribbean too, but I think the Mexican kind of presence is felt stronger in Leamington. I learned about music groups. Like there's at least 3 bands in Leamington that are composed of Mexican migrant workers, and they perform at bars and cantinas and at festivals. And so there's this layer of culture that Leamington has the workers to thank for. And I kind of love that, there was it is kind of it's a wonderful place, it really is, and it's fascinating in how it serves kind of both communities, kind of the Canadian community and this kind of migrant community as well. I mean, there's so many workers here that there's a Mexican consulate, which is wild to think about such a small city having a consulate. And it's as it turns out, I found out later that consulate is in Nino Ricci's father's house. which he built, you know, out of the earnings that he, made as a first as a migrant worker, and then as a farm owner, and yeah, it was wild. It's the most Italian house you'll ever see as well. It's quite something. There's a lot of brick.
Yeah, we've all been the beneficiaries of just incredible cultural contributions by the Mexican and Caribbean workers in the area. We're very fortunate in many ways. So, in the book, you make the point that there are wider political factors, such as the impact of NAFTA or CUSMA, that cause conditions for migrant workers to be forced to seek work overseas. Can you tell us about the couple who brought this to your attention? The Haley.
Oh, like, what are we talking about? Yes. So there's I met the Haleys nearby Simcoe, and they own this lovely little kind of organic tiny farm. But they've become a kind of an, what's the word, an asset to the kind of migrant worker community in Ontario or in Canada writ large, because they've opened up their home to workers who've been fired or have fled from terrible bosses, and they give them a kind of a place to stay, help them out, help them get set up, help them with documents, this kind of stuff. And yeah, and so Ella Haley was talking to me about how, some of the reasons why workers from abroad are migrating in the first place is because of economic conditions imposed upon them by governments like ours. If you look at, for example, what was then called NAFTA, what it did kind of, by subsidizing corn crops in the United States, had caused the price of corn to drop in Mexico. And so these farmers who were making a living, growing corn, as an example, found that they weren't earning that money anymore. And this is what spurs the workers to go elsewhere. This is what spurs the Mexican workers to cross the border into the United States, which I wrote about in a previous book. And it also spurs them to go elsewhere. And we look at, these kind of the excesses of kind of Western capitalism tends to trickle down and harm those of the global South. This is not news to anybody. And just in the way that wars that kind of we start leads to refugees elsewhere. These kinds of things. And so I think we have to look at ourselves as not just the beneficiary of migrant labor, but as the cause of the problems that send them here in the first place. Yeah, like I say at the end of the book, I've written a non-patriotic book at a very patriotic time, and it's true. I think that Canada, in regards to the migrant labor structures in particular, these are failings, and these are mistakes that we're making as a country and have so for decades. There'll come a time in the future where a prime minister will stand up in the House of Commons and apologize officially on behalf of Canada for the treatment of the migrant workers over the decades, just as we've done for residential schools and Japanese internment and these other sorts of our our national shames. This will be one of them, and I just hope that let's fix it before we have to apologize for it. There are solutions here.
Yes, apologies for many things, but not yet Black and Indigenous slavery, but we'll see too. And
There's a long list.
yeah, but very connected. So, I mean, you talked positively about the Haleys and their allyship and their efforts. Did you meet or encounter other folks that are doing great work like that?
The people that impress, yes, of course. There's kind of activists and people working for these organizations that are there to serve kind of these vulnerable workers, right? But the people that really impressed me and inspired me were the workers themselves, who stood up not just for their own problems, their own personal, but for issues of that affect the migrant workers in general. I met some badass women working on this project. Probably the one who stands out the most to me is a woman named Evangeline in Edmonton. And she came as a migrant worker. She lost that job. She was undocumented for a long time. She had a child in Alberta who was denied uh, medical care because even though she was a Canadian citizen, having been born in Edmonton, she was denied medical care because her mother was undocumented. And so Evangeline, instead of staying in the shadows, which is what a lot of undocumented people do, she stood up in front of the cameras and demanded, health care for her child. And with the kind of the cooperation of the larger Filipino community in Edmonton, changed the law in Alberta. The McKenna Rose law in Alberta now guarantees medical care for all Alberta-born children, regardless of what the status of their parents. This law is named after this girl, and it is on the books. And after Evangeline, she's successful in changing the law. She ends up being successful getting her permanent residency. She's fine now. She's doing fine, but she's not being quiet. Like, she's still standing up for workers. And there's so many of them, people like this, who at great personal risk stand up to the system, stand up to their employers, and when they win, stay standing up. And they don't just accept they don't accept like the fruits of their bravery for themselves, but want to stand up there for people like them. And the one thing in this book that I really wanted to make sure readers understood was that, yes, there's these workers are being exploited and treated badly, but they're not quiet, passive victims. We shouldn't just kiss tut at their situations. They are strong, courageous people who are standing up to the abuses. And if they got the courage to stand up, considering the consequences, then we should be standing up for them too.
That's a wonderful story. I love hearing that. But as you say, your time with the migrant workers mostly involved in enumeration of injustices.
That's right.
Yeah. Were there other stories? I think there was one about Julian who helped maybe gave you a little happiness and hope.
Yeah, Julian Leamington. Julian came from Mexico. His father was a great musician. Taught Julian how to play guitar. Julian now plays like every instrument, and so his first paycheck as a migrant worker in Leamington went to buying a guitar. And he started one of the bands in Leamington. One of these kind of migrant worker bands is his, but he also plays with all of them. And he ended up meeting a Canadian woman who saw him perform, loves his music. They fell in love, and they got two kids now. And so, yeah, there's not a lot of happy stories in the book, but Julian's is certainly one of them. Yeah, he's this kind of this big smiling guy who's one of the most charming people I've ever seen. It's just it's natural charm. His wife is lovely, and they have these two beautiful kids. And so things are worked out for Julian for sure, which is I'm happy to see that.
That's wonderful. And I hope there are more stories like that down the line. And so are you, after this mammoth project, are you taking a break, or do you have another project on the go already?
I kind of taken a break from the dark, heavy stories. I think as I don't have a book that I'm working on right now, but I'm doing a lot of magazine work, and they're a little bit more fun. You know what I mean? Like I'm doing a piece right now for Canadian Geographic about these art students in Calgary who started an indie wrestling promotion, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be writing about art school wrestling nerds versus abused migrant workers. This is great, but I can't get that. You can't work on a project like this and get that out of your head. You know what I mean? I follow the news very closely still about migrant labor. And I wouldn't be surprised if something sparks at least a story or a magazine piece. I mean, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, two employers in Calgary who had employed and abused migrant workers got jail sentences for their abuse. I don't think this has ever happened. Someone will correct me, I'm sure. But in all my research over the years working on Precarious, I never heard of an employer being jailed for abuses. And this is a big deal. And it wasn't on some farm, it was like in a restaurant, so I think that story in particular deserves a little bit more attention because it is kind of, is that a paradigm shift? I don't know. I hope so, but it's certainly unique. And I don't think Canadians who are not paying as close attention to this as I am don't realize what a big deal that is.
That's an excellent update, really. Would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Um, I do want to read. I'm gonna read a little bit from the conclusion. After talking, I think it's a good place to end it. So these are the last few pages of the book. Our country's migrant labor policies deny workers a pathway out of otherhood. This country granted the foreign workers of my grandfather's generation and their families a chance to belong, not just to work. They could exchange their foreignness for Canadianness, at least on paper. My grandfather fully embraced this. I remember traveling to Italy with my family when I was a teenager. Nono brought my sisters and me to the Moro River Canadian War Cemetery near Ortona, a 20-minute drive from his hometown. That he insisted we spend an Italian afternoon paying respects to Canada's war dead, soldiers he would have fought against during the war, testified to his deep connection to the country that welcomed him. But Canada renders today's migrants as permanent outsiders. When Sarah bemoaned everything she had to do for that paper, she was really saying she wanted to be unothered enough to reunite with her daughters. She knew that Canada considers such a basic human desire, the need for parents to be with their children, to be a privilege not offered to the paperless. She knew what all migrant workers know, that Canada feels no obligation to people like her. We don't invest in their lives beyond the cheap labor they provide because they are not one of us. Perhaps they don't want to be, at least not entirely. We haven't exactly impressed our guest workers. I recall a woman named Gerlie Pascal telling me that she was not Canadian, even though she received permanent status years ago. I assumed she meant that Canadians didn't treat her like she belonged. I wonder, though, if Gerlie distinguished herself and her fellow Filipinas from citizens who consider themselves above low-paid labor, who exploit migrant workers, and who warehouse their own elderly parents. Maybe Gerlie wasn't complaining when she said she wasn't Canadian. Maybe she was boasting. As an outsider, she could see through our self-delusion and wanted no part of it. I suspect much of the delusion is believing Canada designed our migrant worker program out of altruism. The temporary foreign worker program is not a charity. Temporary work permits aren't akin to the winter coats Trudeau handed out to Syrian refugees at the airport. The official goal of the program, according to the government website, is plainly to hire workers to fill temporary jobs when qualified Canadians are not available. Not to ensure Sarah's children are cared for in India or to provide Julian's mother with a bigger house in Mexico. When the government evaluated the program in 2021, it didn't examine whether or not the workers' lives were improved, only the program's impact on the Canadian labor market. The policies aren't meant to give, but to take. Maybe one of the reasons Canada mistreats migrant workers is because we see them only through this mercenary lens. We define them solely by their functionality, by the singular task we've hired them to do. We assume they define Canada in similarly shallow terms, not a place to live, but a place to work. And yet, the migrants I met all transcended their low-paying jobs. They had a larger purpose than grinding out a bi-weekly paycheck. They worked for their futures and for the reunification of their families. They formed communities. They stood up against injustices perpetrated against themselves and others. As Raoul said to me, we help each other in the good and bad times. These are the values we consider to be Canadian. These are the same values my grandfather held. He brought more than just his labor to Canada. Hundreds of Calgary Italians mourned his passing because of the man he was, not for the concrete he poured. If we didn't identify my Nono by his labor, then we owe the same respect to the migrants who come to work here now. Migrant workers don't want much from Canada. I met no worker with unreasonable expectations. All Celeste and Griselda wanted was to be together. Gabriel just wanted the chance to be a good dad. And Neil wanted therapy for his daughter, Ryan to pray over her dying mother. Workers want bunkhouses free of vermin and workplaces free of lecherous supervisors. They want fair wages and fair treatment. Like all of us, they want a better life. If Canada were as Canadian as we claim, if we embodied the idea that we're no longer a white man's country, but a place that welcomes all, we'd feel more responsible for the migrants because of their vulnerability, not less. We wouldn't force them to choose opportunity over home while we, as citizens, take for granted we can have both. Instead, our treatment of migrants undermines our own fragile national fiction. Our failure to live up to our own billing has ramifications not only on how others see and will see us, but on how we'll come to see ourselves. By diminishing the dignity of our most precarious workers, we diminish our own.
So true. Marcello Di Cintio's latest book is Precarious, The Lives of Migrant Workers, available from Biblioasis Press. Marcello, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.